Thomas Miller, a skeptical and lonely man, never believed in God or spirituality. But one night, in a moment of deep despair, he has a conversation that challenges everything he has ever believed. What did God reveal to Thomas? How did this conversation transform your life? And what can we learn from the journey of a man who went from disbelief to purpose? Discover how a divine encounter can change everything. I'm Anthony Bennett, and welcome to my Near-Death Experience channel. Let's listen to the story together. Thomas Miller was a 45-year-old man born and raised in a small rural Texas town. He was known for his sharp intelligence and the skepticism he cultivated from a young age. Thomas, a successful civil engineer, was a practical man who believed only in what he could see and touch. Religion, faith, and everything that could not be explained by scientific logic were, for him, mere illusions created to comfort the weak. His skepticism ran deep, and he never hesitated to debate anyone who tried to convince him otherwise. Thomas's childhood was marked by the early loss of his parents, which made him question the goodness and justice in the world from a young age. His parents died in a tragic car accident when he was just 10 years old, leaving him in the care of a distant aunt. The grief that followed the loss caused him to begin to doubt the existence of any benevolent higher being. If God existed, Thomas thought, how could he allow such terrible things to happen to good people? This question took deep root in his mind and shaped his beliefs for the rest of his life. As Thomas grew older, his disbelief in God and religion grew stronger. He dedicated himself to his studies and his career, seeking answers to the world in numbers and exact sciences. For Thomas, the world was a place governed by immutable physical laws, and any attempt to explain the universe through spirituality was seen as an escape from reality. He built his life on logic and reason, avoiding everything he considered irrational or emotionally charged. Thomas also developed a cynical view of humanity. He saw the suffering all around him, the poverty, the wars, the diseases, and this only reinforced his belief that if a God existed, he was certainly not benevolent. He saw no purpose in the pain people faced daily, and this further distanced him from any idea of divinity. His disbelief became part of his identity, something he defended with conviction. Despite his professional success, Thomas led a lonely life. He never married, and his relationships were brief and superficial. He saw no value in the search for love or deep connections, believing that everyone was just trying to fill a void that would never truly be filled. For Thomas, life was about surviving and making the best of the cards he was dealt, without expecting anything more than what he could achieve with his own hands. This cold, pragmatic view of life kept Thomas away from many of the joys that other people experienced. He lived surrounded by his own barriers, comfortably wrapped in his bubble of skepticism. But as life often demonstrates, there are things that cannot be predicted or controlled, and Thomas was about to face an experience that would challenge everything he believed to be true. Despite his cynical outlook on life, Thomas was not immune to the suffering that the world seemed to dump on him and those around him. Over the past few years, he had witnessed a series of events that shook him to his core, even if he tried to ignore or rationalize them. Her younger sister, Emily, was diagnosed with a terminal illness, something that devastated what little family she had left. Emily, unlike Thomas, was a person of faith, and her calmness in the face of death only increased Thomas's skepticism. He couldn't understand how anyone could accept suffering with such serenity. Emily's worsening illness meant that Thomas spent more time at her side, trying to offer what he could in terms of comfort and support. But inside, he was at war with himself. He couldn't accept what was happening, and it started to affect his mental health. Thomas felt helpless in the face of the situation, something that his logical and controlling mind could not bear. He began to question everything, including the very reason for his existence. If there was no greater purpose, why was all this happening? The pain of watching Emily slowly deteriorate consumed him. Thomas began to have difficulty sleeping, his appetite decreased, and he became even more distant from the few people he had contact with. His mind, once clear and focused, was now overwhelmed with dark thoughts. He repeatedly asked himself why the world was so cruel. Why did good people like Emily have to suffer while so many others who, in his view, deserved nothing, continued to live their lives without any major mishaps? These questions began to eat away at Thomas inside. His disbelief toward God and spirituality was strong, but now it was mixed with deep resentment. If there was a superior being, he must be cruel or indifferent, Thomas thought. The world was full of pain, and he didn't see the point in it all. This feeling of hopelessness began to overwhelm him, and for the first time in his life, Thomas felt like he was losing control. One particularly difficult night, after visiting Emily in the hospital and seeing her in a state of extreme weakness, Thomas had an emotional breakdown. He was in his apartment, alone, sitting in the dark, his mind spinning around the same unanswered questions. The weight of Emily's grief, the lack of purpose he felt, and the frustration of not being able to do anything began to pile up in a way Thomas had never experienced before. He tried to resort to what had always helped him overcome difficulties, logic and reason, but this time, it seemed like nothing made sense. Thomas felt completely lost, aimless, and for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to feel the pain in all its intensity. It was as if a dam inside him had broken, and all the grief, anger, and despair he had suppressed for years came flooding out. In that moment, Thomas found himself screaming into the void, questioning the universe, existence, and even God, if he even existed. It was then that something unexpected happened. In the midst of his despair, as his words echoed in the darkness of the apartment, Thomas began to feel a presence. It was as if the air around him had changed, as if something or someone was there with him. Skeptical Thomas, who never believed in anything other than what he could see and touch, felt a shiver run down his spine. He stopped screaming, his heart racing, and looked around, trying to understand what was happening. He was about to have an experience that would change his life forever. The silence that followed Thomas's scream was profound, almost tangible. He remained there, sitting in the dark, his breathing ragged as he tried to process the strange sensation that enveloped him. It was as if the environment around him had transformed, the air seemed denser, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Thomas, a man who had always trusted logic and reason, suddenly felt small and vulnerable in the face of something he couldn't understand. Suddenly, a soft light began to fill the room. It was not a blinding light, but rather a warm, comforting glow emanating from a point in front of Thomas. He stared in disbelief as the light took shape. As the figure materialized, Thomas felt his heart beat faster. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew he was about to witness something extraordinary. When the figure finally revealed itself, Thomas was speechless. Before him stood a serene-looking man, with eyes that seemed to carry all the wisdom and kindness of the universe. The man's presence radiated peace, but also an authority that Thomas had never felt before. A lifetime of skepticism was being challenged at that moment, and Thomas didn't know how to react. The figure seemed to transcend any image he had of the divine. It was as if he was faced with something that was both familiar and incomprehensible. Thomas, still dazed, finally managed to speak. Who are you?" he asked, his voice coming out as a whisper. The man looked at him with a gentle but deep gaze that seemed to pierce through Thomas's soul. "I am the one you always questioned, Thomas," the figure replied, his voice echoing softly through the room. "I am the one you denied, who you defied, but who was also always by your side." The man's words hit Thomas like a shock. Are you God?" he asked in disbelief, almost not believing what he was saying. The man nodded slowly. "Yes, Thomas. I am." The impact of these words left Thomas completely bewildered. He, who he had always ridiculed the idea of a superior being, now he found himself facing the one he always claimed did not exist. Thomas's logical mind struggled to comprehend what was happening, but something in his heart knew this was real. Thomas felt a mix of emotions: confusion, fear, anger, and something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "If you are God, then explain it to me," he said, his voice filled with desperate defiance. "Explain to me why the world is so full of pain and suffering. Explain to me why good people like my sister have to die, while so many others continue to live. If you are so powerful, why don't you do anything?" God's expression remained serene, but his eyes reflected the depth of Thomas's question. "I understand your pain, Thomas. And I understand why you feel this anger and frustration. Suffering is a part of the human experience that often seems meaningless, but there are reasons that go beyond what your mind can comprehend. I'm here to talk to you, to answer your questions, but also to show you that there is more to life than just what you can see and touch." Thomas remained silent, absorbing God's words. He didn't know what to expect from that conversation, but one thing was certain: his world had just been turned upside down, and nothing would be the same again. Thomas's mind was in turmoil. Before him stood the figure he never believed existed: God. The questions he had harbored all his life, the doubts and skepticism that had defined him, now exploded in his mind, crying out for answers. The anger and frustration he had felt for so many years, especially in the face of his sister's suffering, spilled over into words he could barely control. "If you are God, then why is the world so full of pain? Why do good people like Emily have to suffer so much? Why do you allow so many injustices to happen?" God, with his calm expression and eyes full of understanding, patiently listened to Thomas's outburst. When he finished, breathless and still overcome with emotion, God responded with a serenity that seemed to carry the weight of eons. "Thomas, suffering is one of the most difficult parts of human existence, and I understand your pain and your questions. But suffering is not something I impose on people. It is a consequence of the freedom you have, the complexity of world in which they live." Thomas, still struggling to understand, replied, "But why then don't you intervene? Why don't you do anything to stop good people from suffering and evil from prevailing?" God tilted his head slightly, as if pondering the best way to explain something very complex. "I give every human being free will, Thomas. The freedom to make choices, to love, to learn and grow. But with that freedom comes responsibility and the consequences of those choices. Pain and suffering are often the result of these choices, not just yours, but those of all humanity." God's words touched something deep in Thomas, but he still wasn't satisfied. "But what about those who suffer for no reason? Those who never did anything wrong? Like my sister, who was always good, always believed in you, and now she's dying. Is that fair?" God looked at Thomas with a mix of sadness and compassion. "Life is not about what is fair or unfair in the way you understand it, Thomas. Existence is much more complex than that duality. Emily is suffering, yes, but what you don't see is that, through that suffering, she is moving closer to a greater understanding, a deeper love." Thomas shook his head, still in disbelief. "That seems cruel. If you're all-powerful, why wouldn't you spare those you love from that kind of pain?" God moved a little closer, his presence radiating a warmth that seemed to ease the burden on his chest. "I am with each one of you, in every moment of pain and joy. Suffering is not a punishment, but rather a part of the path of learning and growth that each soul takes. And when that journey ends, there is a peace and an understanding that goes beyond what you can imagine." Thomas felt his heart sink. "So, you're saying that Emily is suffering for a greater purpose? That her pain has some meaning that I can't understand?" God nodded. "Exactly, Thomas. But know that I don't take joy in her suffering, or anyone else's. I am with her, just as I am with you, offering comfort and love, even if you don't realize it. And when her time here is up, she will be welcomed into a place of peace, where all pain and suffering will no longer have power." Thomas was silent, processing everything he had heard. His worldview, built over decades of skepticism, was being deconstructed before him. He didn't know how to reconcile what he was experiencing with everything he had always believed. But at the same time, he felt a strange sense of relief, as if some of the weight he had been carrying was being gently lifted. God watched Thomas, noticing the internal struggle he was having. "Thomas," he said softly, "I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm here to talk to you, to offer you a different perspective. The pain and suffering and injustices of the world are real, but so are the opportunities for love, compassion, and growth that arise from these experiences. And that is something you can choose to see or not." Thomas looked up to God, feeling for the first time a connection to something greater than himself. He still had many questions, many doubts, but now he was willing to listen, to try to understand. Thomas felt shaken when he heard God's words, but he knew there were still unanswered questions, and the skepticism he had carried all his life would not disappear so easily. "You talk about a greater purpose and about suffering being a necessary part of the human journey. But how can I believe that all this really has meaning? Why is there so much pain, so much injustice? Where is the love you say exists in all this?" Thomas's words came out with a tone of defiance, but also a deep need to understand. God watched him with a serene expression, understanding the weight of the questions Thomas was carrying. "Thomas, I know it's hard to accept that suffering can have any value. But human life is complex, and pain often serves as a catalyst for growth, for compassion, for change. Suffering, although painful, can bring out the best in people, can unite hearts, can awaken the purest and most unconditional love. This does not mean that I want them to suffer, but that even in the darkness, there is a light that can emerge." Thomas listened carefully, but there was still an uneasiness in his heart. "So, you're saying that suffering is necessary? That we need to go through all this to become better? That seems cruel and unfair. There are so many good people, like my sister, who suffer for no apparent reason. And there is so much evil that it seems go unpunished. How can this be part of a bigger plan?" Thomas's frustration was evident, but it also reflected his deep desire to find meaning in everything he was experiencing. "I understand your frustration, Thomas. From your human perspective, many things seem meaningless or cruel. But existence goes beyond what you can see and understand. The free will I give every human being brings with it responsibility of your actions and the consequences they have on the world. The evil you see is often the result of human choices, but that doesn't mean that those choices don't have repercussions. See now, good will always prevail in the end." Thomas reflected on these words, feeling a slight shift in his perception. "So you're saying that there is a justice that I can't see, that even the evil that seems to triumph will be righted somehow? But what about those who suffer now? How can I accept that they go through so much just for something to change in the future?" God smiled softly, realizing that Thomas was beginning to understand, but was still struggling to fully accept. "Today's suffering is not in vain, Thomas. It can lead to a greater good, to a transformation that you may not see right away. But know that I am with everyone, and every moment, offering comfort and love, even when everything seems lost." The weight of God's words began to penetrate Thomas's heart, but there was still a part of his mind that resisted, that struggled to reconcile everything he had heard with the reality he had always known. He knew this conversation was challenging his entire worldview, but he also knew that if he wanted to find peace, he would need to open his heart to this new perspective. With a deep sigh, Thomas finally said, "I still have doubts, but I'm willing to try to understand. I want to believe that there is a purpose, that there is meaning to all of this. But I need time to process everything you've told me." After the conversation with God, Thomas was left alone in his apartment, plunged into profound silence. The experience he had just experienced left him in a state of shock, but it also opened a door within him that he never knew existed. Thomas, who had always been skeptical and trusted only logic, now found himself faced with something that challenged all of his beliefs. He knew he needed time to process everything he had heard and decide how it would impact his life going forward. Over the next few days, Thomas began to reflect deeply on the conversation. He removed himself from the usual distractions and spent hours in silence, mentally revisiting every word God spoke to him. Although there was still resistance within him, something was changing. He began to realize that no matter how much he tried to control and understand everything with his rational mind, there were aspects of life that escaped his understanding. And maybe, he thought, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The anger and frustration that had previously consumed him began to give way to a growing curiosity. Thomas began to wonder if, over the years, his rejection of the idea of a higher power had been a way of protecting himself from the pain and suffering he couldn't explain. He realized that by denying the existence of something greater, he was actually trying to find a way to control the chaos he saw around him. But now, that need for control was being questioned. Thomas also began to observe the world in a different way. He began to notice small acts of kindness and compassion that he would have overlooked before. He began to see suffering with a new perspective, not as proof of the absence of God, but perhaps as an opportunity for growth and transformation, both for himself and for others. This new perspective did not eliminate their doubts, but it created space for a more complex and less rigid view of reality. Thomas's relationship with his sister Emily also began to change. He came to value her even more, not only for the love they always shared, but also for the unwavering faith she demonstrated throughout her illness. Thomas began to see Emily as a source of wisdom and inspiration, someone who somehow understood what he was just beginning to discover. He started spending more time with her, not only to support her, but to learn from her serenity in the face of death. The inner change that Thomas experienced was slow but profound. He began to open up to new ideas, to new ways of seeing the world, and this brought a sense of relief that he hadn't felt in years. Although he still had many unanswered questions, Thomas began to accept that perhaps not all the answers were necessary. The important thing, he realized, was to live with an open heart, seeking connection, love, and understanding, rather than clinging to rigid certainties that isolated him from the rest of the world. The transformation Thomas was experiencing began to be reflected in his daily life. Once a lonely and skeptical man, he now found himself seeking deeper connections with those around him. At work, Thomas began interacting more with his colleagues, showing a genuine interest in their lives. He, who had previously maintained an emotional distance from everyone, now asked questions, listened, and offered support in a way that surprised everyone, including himself. These changes did not go unnoticed by those around him. His colleagues noticed that Thomas, previously seen as a distant and pragmatic man, now radiated a calm and gentleness they had never seen before. He began to be sought out for advice, not just on technical matters, but also on personal matters. Thomas, who previously would have shied away from these conversations, now embraced them, seeing them as an opportunity to grow and connect more meaningfully with others. At home, Thomas also began to open up more to his own emotions. He allowed himself to feel sadness, fear, and even love in ways he previously avoided. He began to meditate, reflect on his life, and explore aspects of his spirituality that he had always rejected. The change in his relationship with Emily was also profound. As he spent more time with her, Thomas began to share his own internal struggles, something he had never done before. Emily, in turn, received these confidences with love and understanding, which further strengthened the bond between them. Emily's suffering, which had previously seemed like an unbearable burden to Thomas, was now seen in a new light. He began to understand that despite the pain, there was something deeply meaningful about the way Emily dealt with her illness. Her serenity, her acceptance of death, and her unwavering faith touched Thomas in a way he never imagined possible. He began to see in Emily a teacher, someone who, through her own suffering, was showing him the way to inner peace. When Emily passed away, Thomas was by her side. Her sister's death was a moment of immense sadness, but also of profound peace. He held her hand until his last breath, feeling a connection that went beyond words. Instead of succumbing to despair and anger, Thomas felt a calm acceptance. He knew that Emily had found peace, and in some ways, that brought him comfort. He knew that her journey had come to an end, but that she would continue to live within him, guiding him on his own journey. As time passed, Thomas continued to live with a new purpose. He became involved in volunteer work, helping people who, like him and Emily, were facing extreme hardship. This new life brought Thomas a joy and fulfillment he had never known. He discovered that by helping others, he was also helping himself heal his own wounds. Thomas, who once defined himself by his skepticism, now lived with a heart full of compassion and love. After Emily's death, Thomas felt there was a void to be filled in his life. He knew he couldn't just go back to his old way of living, but he also didn't know exactly how to move forward. It was then that he decided to honor his sister's memory in a way that could continue the legacy of love and compassion she left behind. Thomas, who has always been a man of action, began thinking about how he could make a difference in people's lives in the same way Emily did in his. Inspired by Emily's serenity and faith, Thomas decided to found an organization in her memory. The foundation, which he called Emily's Light, would aim to offer support to terminally ill people and their families. Thomas wanted to create a space where people could find comfort, where they could share their stories, and where they could feel like they weren't alone in their journey. He believed that by doing so he would be perpetuating Emily's spirit and helping others find the peace he found himself. Working at the foundation brought Thomas a sense of purpose and fulfillment that he had never experienced before. He used his skills as an engineer to ensure the organization was efficient and effective, but he also brought something new to the project, a deep sense of empathy and compassion that he had never known before. Thomas became personally involved with the people the foundation helped, listening to their stories, offering advice, and, most of all, being there for them in a way he had never been for anyone before. As the foundation grew, Thomas also began to reconnect with the world in ways he hadn't expected. He began to open up to new experiences, explore new interests, and seek deeper connections with the people around him. He reconnected with friends and colleagues he had left behind during years of skepticism and isolation. These reconnections brought new joy to Thomas's life, and he began to see the world through different eyes. Thomas also began to get involved in volunteer work outside of the foundation, helping with various causes that resonated with the values he now embraced. He discovered that by helping others, he was finding a new way to heal himself and continue his own spiritual journey. Every act of kindness, every moment of compassion, was a way to honor Emily's memory and continue the path he had started with her. Over time, Thomas's life became a true expression of the love and compassion he had discovered. He found a new purpose, a new way of living that was rich in meaning and connection. Thomas, who had previously lived in a prison of skepticism and isolation, now embraced life with an open heart and a mind full of possibilities. He knew he still had much to learn and explore, but he also knew he was on the right path, living a life that honored all he had discovered on his journey with God. Over the years, the Emily's Light Foundation has grown to become a beacon of hope for many people. The impact she had on the lives of those facing terminal illnesses and their loved ones was profound. The organization not only offered practical support, but also provided a space for people to find spiritual and emotional solace. Thomas, who had previously seen himself as distant from matters of faith, was now at the center of a community that lived and breathed compassion and love. Thomas, who had always avoided talking about spirituality, began sharing his story with everyone he met. He talked about the conversation he had with God, how this experience changed his life, and how Emily's journey inspired him to find a new purpose. His words deeply touched those who heard him, many of whom were on their own journeys of searching for meaning and peace. Thomas realized that by sharing his story, he was helping others find their own light. Thomas's impact went beyond the foundation. He began to be invited to speak at conferences, churches, and community groups where he shared his renewed worldview. He did not preach a specific faith, but encouraged people to seek their own truths, to find what gave them peace and purpose. Thomas has become a living example of how pain and suffering can be transformed into something positive, into a force for growth and connection. Her story began to inspire many to pursue their own journeys of self-discovery. Thomas's life continued to expand in ways he never imagined. He began exploring new forms of art and expression, using painting, music, and writing as ways to process his emotions and share his experiences. Creativity became a central part of his life, bringing him a sense of joy and fulfillment he had never known before. Each work he created was a celebration of his journey, a way of expressing the love and compassion that now guided his life. Thomas also found love again. He met someone special through working at the foundation, a woman who shared his passion for helping others and who, like him, had gone through her own journey of self-discovery. The relationship that blossomed between them was based on mutual respect, understanding, and a deep spiritual connection. Thomas, who had previously closed his heart to love, now embraced it completely, knowing that this love was an essential part of his new life. As the years passed, Thomas continued to live with purpose and gratitude, knowing he was on the right path. He still faced challenges and doubts, but now he faced them with the knowledge that he was surrounded by love, guided by something greater than himself. And that, for Thomas, was the greatest legacy of all. He knew that his life was making a difference, that he was leaving a world a little better than he found it, and that he was honoring Emily's memory in every act of kindness and every life he touched. As Thomas grew older, he began to reflect on the life he had lived and the legacy he was building. He knew time was passing, but instead of fearing this reality, he embraced it with serenity. He continued his work at the foundation, helping people and sharing his story, but he also began preparing for what he knew would be the last part of his journey. Thomas, who once feared death, now saw it as a natural transition, a continuation of the spiritual journey he had begun. In the last years of his life, Thomas found an inner peace that many around him admired. He became a respected and beloved figure, someone to whom people turned for advice and inspiration. Thomas continued to meditate, reflect on his life, and seek connection with his spirituality in a deep way. He knew that no matter what the future brought, he had lived a life full of purpose, love, and compassion. And it brought him a satisfaction he had never known before. When it was time to leave, Thomas was surrounded by those who loved him. His health was failing, but his mind and spirit were stronger than ever. He held his partner's hand and smiled, feeling a deep gratitude for everything he had experienced. "I'm ready," he said softly, and his words were met with tears of love and acceptance. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the presence of God, of Emily, and of all those who had guided him throughout his life. Thomas passed peacefully, leaving behind a legacy of love, compassion, and transformation. The Emily's Light Foundation continued to grow, helping more and more people find peace and purpose in their own lives. Thomas's words and teachings were remembered and shared by those he touched, and his story continued to inspire many to seek their own truths and live with an open heart. Thomas's legacy has become a symbol of resilience, of how pain and suffering can be overcome and transformed into something beautiful and powerful. After his death, many who knew Thomas gathered to celebrate his life. They talked about the impact he had, how he had changed their lives, and the example of faith and compassion he left behind. His partner, who was his companion in life and journey, led the tributes, sharing stories of their life together and the lessons she learned from him. It was a celebration of a life well lived, of a journey that, although full of challenges, was filled with meaning and love. In the end, Thomas's life was a testament to the human capacity to change, grow, and find purpose in the midst of chaos and suffering. He had started out as a skeptic, a man closed to spirituality and life's deeper connections, but he ended up as someone who found the inner peace and purpose he had been searching for. Her journey was proof that no matter where we start, there is always the possibility for transformation, for growth, and for finding our way home.